All right, well, I think everybody's making their way in, so it's time to begin the festivities. I want to begin by obviously welcoming all of you here and how excited I am, and I think all of us at Maxwell are, to see such a wonderful turnout. This is really an exciting occasion for all of us, and it's really exciting to be able to share it with you. This is a momentous opportunity for the Maxwell School to have a chance to be part of this wonderful institution here at CSIS, to be able to bring Maxwell to an even broader community here in Washington in a fabulous state-of-the-art facility, and to have so many of our friends and supporters be here to share this special evening with us. It's really a great occasion. I'm glad you've had a chance to see a little bit of this wonderful building that John Hamre and CSIS have built, and hope you'll have a chance later to come down and see some of the facilities down on the concourse and first floor that are places where we're teaching and holding meetings and conferences, and really get to feel the excitement that we all feel about being part of this. Our opportunity here in this building and this partnership with CSIS is really remarkable, because it gives us a chance to expand almost everything that we do, from partnerships and scholarship with a tremendous team that works here at CSIS, to opportunities for our students not only to take courses here, but to have internships and participate in the programs of CSIS, to expand our efforts to reach so many people here in Washington who are looking for mid-career opportunities and training, and to build new activities in that space as well, and to reach out to all of you, our friends and supporters and alumni. And Ryan Williams is with us here in the back. He's the Master of Ceremonies for Maxwell in Washington, and I know he's thrilled to see so many of you and looks forward to having you participate as much as you can in these activities. And it's a notable occasion. This is actually the 20th anniversary of Maxwell's undergraduate international relations programming in DC, and it's the 33rd year for our graduate public administration capstone program here. So there's a long tradition of Maxwell being here in Washington, but I think you'll all share my view that this helps us take it to a new level. And I'm really thankful to everybody at CSIS who's made the Maxwell community feel so welcome here. Starting in December, we hosted our National Security Studies 2-day refresher course here at the CSIS building, followed closely by an intersession course on tax policy and politics hosted by Len Berman, who's with us here tonight as well. Thank you, Len, for doing that. We've had a number of other programs that have been developed by our centers and institutes to engage with the CSIS team. The Institute for Security and Counterterrorism both had successful and well-attended events here. Coming up, we have 2 graduate courses on African development and Latin American policy in May, and 2 7-week summer graduate courses focusing on China in the 21st century and energy and geopolitics. So you can see what a great opportunity this is for our students and the excitement that they are going to feel for being here. We have a fall graduate program on global security and development, which will bring in many Maxwell students, as well as students from other programs, including the universities of Denver and Pittsburgh. We've had CSIS guest speakers participate in our programs, and we've had already 2 of our student interns working in the CSIS Europe program. So I think it is, as I say, an exciting opportunity. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of what's possible in this, and I welcome your thoughts and suggestions about how we can do even more to make this partnership work and expand Maxwell's presence. I'm particularly delighted to have so many of the members of our advisory board here with us tonight. We're going to be having an advisory board meeting after the program today, and it's a great chance for us all to get together and to share in this program. But I especially want to thank the leadership of CSIS, John Hamre, who was instrumental in making this happen. I've been fortunate through my already too long career in public service to have worked with John over the past 30 years, and there's no greater public servant that I know of, nobody more dedicated to doing good for our country and for the world than John. And the fact that he chose Maxwell to be his partner, I think, is a great honor for all of us. And I want to personally thank Tony Cordesman from CSIS for participating in this program. I've also had the pleasure of knowing and working with Tony over many years, and there's no greater and finer thinker about some of the complex security issues that we face than Tony. I also want to thank my good friend and colleague Sean O'Keefe, who's the chair of our advisory board and has played an instrumental role. He's, as you all know, given so much to Maxwell in so many capacities over the years, and it's been a privilege for me to be able to work with him. We have a number of members of our faculty here today who are participating in this evening's events, and I'm grateful to them for all being here as well as the many alumni who are here. But I especially want to thank the leadership of the Maxwell DC Alumni Association who are here. And I wonder if you all might stand up just so everybody can recognize. Alex, I think you're here, and the leadership team. Maybe you could just stand so people can see some of the people who've made this all possible. You all know well the power of the Maxwell Network, and it's one of the very special things that keeps us together as a community, and their efforts are particularly impressive in making sure that both past and current students really have the opportunity to benefit from all the generations of experience that you've all developed over the years. So it's now my pleasure to begin to turn to the program and to welcome our special guest for this evening's discussion. First, I'll begin with Tony Cordesman, who holds the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS. Tony has done incredibly far-ranging work over the years on energy, U.S. strategy and defense, the lessons of modern warfare, defense programming and budgeting, NATO modernization, which is looking all the more relevant these days, Tony, Chinese military power, counterterrorism, and security in the Middle East, where Tony has tremendous expertise and is greatly respected. Before Tony came to CSIS, he served as the Director of Intelligence Assessment at the Office of the Secretary of Defense and as a civilian assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Before that, he was Director of Policy and Planning for Research Applications at the Energy Department and as a National Security Assistant to Senator John McCain, and he is the recipient of the Department of Defense's Distinguished Service Medal. Pleased to have also with us tonight Professor Renée de Nevers, who is an associate professor at our Department of Public Administration and International Affairs. Before coming to Maxwell, Renée taught at the University of Oklahoma, and she was a program officer at the MacArthur Foundation before that. She's been a research fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard, at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, and the Hoover Institute, as well as the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And she was a Fulbright scholar a couple of years ago in Russia. She has her PhD from Columbia, and her current research focuses on the regulation and accountability of private military and security companies and state efforts to protect or manipulate sovereignty. She's the author of Comrades No More, The Seeds of Change in Eastern Europe, which again we're seeing happen before our eyes, and the co-author of Combating Terrorism, Strategies and Approaches. And finally, on the podium tonight, Deborah Alexander, who is a former senior policy advisor at the State Department and a veteran of several conflict and stabilization missions, including, most relevant to tonight, Afghanistan. After 16 years at the State Department, including assignments with USAID and the Department of Defense, she now serves as a senior subject matter expert and senior mentor with IDS International and the U.S. Army's Joint Regional Training Center and their National Training Center. She also works with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on upcoming overseas elections. And it's her experience that I think began with her work at Maxwell, where she earned her Master's of Social Science degree in 1982 and a PhD in Social Science in 1995 that I hope made an important contribution to the work that she's done since then. So please join me in welcoming our panelists tonight, which for what I know is going to be a terrific discussion.
I just spread a whole bunch of papers, but let me just say that my function here, in any case, is fairly limited. It is to spend roughly 10 minutes provoking two real experts from the Maxwell School and to really focus on some of the issues that can introduce and allow them to deal with their expertise in a problem that we sometimes call post-conflict reconstruction. And the problem, of course, is in almost every case, it isn't post-conflict. We have seen this in Afghanistan, where we had dramatic initial victories, and we are still fighting a war. We are watching it in Iraq, where we are going back at a low level into Iraq, as we are in Jordan, to support that conflict and to support the regime in dealing with extremists in the west of Iraq. It is a reality that when you look at peacekeeping operations, I remember some years ago talking to Kofi Annan, and he, just before he left the UN, found that the recidivist rate from peacekeeping operations within 5 years was over 50%. In other words, you don't end the conflict, you simply see it mutate and change. And we are on the edge, days away from an election in Afghanistan that may or may not work, may or may not produce leaders. After 10 years, we have no clear plan for moving forward on the economic or military level that has yet been put out by the president. We find ourselves talking about a strategy we announced in January of 2012 that says we will not repeat these conflicts and these issues. We may not repeat it on the ground as we have, but when we look at the problems of Egypt, the problems of Syria, the problems of Iraq, the problems of Yemen, the problems of Somalia, and that is one narrow area. And it excluded Afghanistan and Pakistan and the states around it. It is nice to have a strategy that says we won't do it, but reality has already decisively intervened. And the history has been a very troubled one. I'm going to look forward very much to the comments that are going to follow what I say. We didn't just introduce democracies. We tried to change and create a constitution. We tried to reshape the military forces. We tried to reshape the legal system and the rule of law. We tried to reshape the police forces. We tried to reshape the structure of governance, and we tried to reshape the economies in 2 different countries. And in both cases, we had some very striking successes, and we had some very important failures. The military forces in both countries remain problematic. We are going back into Iraq as advisors and providing arms because we were not successful in creating a stable structure. In fact, many of the advisors saw the Iraqis revert in terms of corruption, in terms of failures in the command structures within months of our departure. General Dunford faces the reality inside Afghanistan that we will not be able to hold parts of the South and the East. We are not relying simply on military forces, but local police forces. And we have no idea as yet how well these can be administered or run, or whether we can sustain the kind of military advisory posture we need. I think we watched efforts at almost every level to build up local government and ministries. In a lot of areas, we had partial successes. But I think in both the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, there are 177 countries that are rated for corruption in Transparency International. Iraq and Afghanistan rank 171st and 175th worst. And that is only one of a series of measures, which very consistently applies to virtually every aspect of governance and the economy in the World Bank, IMF, and UN ratings. We are ourselves caught up in the fact right now we are in a massive retrograde, pulling our units outside of Afghanistan. And we are involved in this whole issue without having a clear plan for either state or the Department of Defense as to how many forward groups we will have, where our advisors will go, how many there will be. We do not at this point even have a budget. There is a bit of a budget in the State Department, but at this point, all we have are placeholder numbers for the Department of Defense. 10 years on, we don't even know the cost of these two wars. It's somewhere roughly between 1.3 and 1.6 trillion dollars, and it's roughly 7,000 casualties, dead, and roughly 55,000 wounded. And those are only Americans, not our allies, Iraqis, or Afghans. We have not been able to develop integrated civil-military plans to deal with the situation in Afghanistan. We had something approaching a civil-military plan in Iraq. Having seen the plans in Vietnam, there was an important difference. In Vietnam, we changed the plan every year, and it consisted almost exclusively of a bunch of concepts. And we would portray it in view graphs. We have made an immense stride forward in planning, and we now use PowerPoint. But when you see these plans, what you get is a whole bunch of random vectors, arrows. Rather interestingly, sometimes the arrow is in a circle. That's always a reassuring sign of effective public administration. We are not going to know whether we have a functioning structure of governance in Afghanistan on the 5th of April, probably not on the 8th of April. The people who are the leading candidates have never really governed or led in any broad sense of a structure of governance. We do know there's an election coming up in Iraq, but it is an election now dominated by a largely Shiite faction dealing with an isolated Kurdish area and fighting a civil war that it provoked against its own Sunnis. And exactly what we mean by democracy becomes a very interesting issue. So these are the realities we face. We also really have to start thinking about where we're going. We've talked about a strategy of partnerships on a military and a strategic level throughout the world. But many of those partners are partners which basically face truly deep economic, political, ethnic, and sectarian problems. These are not stable countries. They're not countries which will move forward without outside help and support. So these, I think, are the tangible examples of the issues that I'm going to be turning to two experts to address. And having, I think, taken my 10 minutes, let me turn to those experts at this point. Now, I was given a list of questions to ask, and I'm going to modify them slightly. I'm not going to use the word post-conflict. But as you look at the lessons of Iraq, Afghanistan, in terms of trying to create post-conflict operations on the part of the U.S. government, what are the major lessons that you would raise? Now, let me begin first with you, Deborah, and then go to your colleague.
Thank you. Well, you certainly laid out an ambitious list of challenges in your opening remarks, and I hope that no one here imagines that I have all the answers to those challenges. There are a number of lessons that in my own work, as we say, we don't say lessons learned anymore, we talk about lessons identified. Knowing that generations don't always learn the lessons from the past. There's a host of lessons, and part of what I have been doing in the months since I've returned is sort of, looking at the literature, reading some of the good writings that have been done. And thinking about Afghanistan, I arrived in Afghanistan the winter of 2001, 2002, and I left last year. And it's hard for me to narrow down just a few lessons, but I'll jump into a few. I might say that if we're going into a nation-building mission, we might need to make a commitment to that early on. as I recall, it wasn't really until after 2004 or 5 that we seriously started talking about governance in Afghanistan, even though there was elections in 2004 and 2005. And elections are sort of sexy, you know, elections are the Super Bowl. Governance, people sort of, we talk about governance, we talk about public administration, state building, and people yawn. But that's what happens, that's what a nation needs that's come out of the years of conflict that Afghanistan had. And so we focused our efforts and our time and attention on elections. That was after there was a constitution. But we didn't really talk about governance until, as I said, really 2005 or 6, we started talking about, oh yeah, what's this thing called state building? But again, as a nation, we hadn't made a commitment to do nation building. So one, I would say, is that there needs to be a more clear focus. If you're going into a place like Afghanistan that had the problems as deep and wide that Afghanistan had, there needed to be some clarity about if we were part of a nation-building mission, what that meant, and the willingness to fund it. Another thing that I think of that's important is that the disparity between budgets. I remember the DoD budget in 2003 or 4, something like maybe $12 to $14 billion. The Department of State and AID budget was maybe $2 billion. And there was always that discrepancy. Certainly in the early days of Afghanistan, we were focused on security and on military operations. But a budget, and again, needing a budget for our commitment there. I might suggest also that we probably need to finish one war before we start another war. That would be an observation about lessons learned. I also would think that if I had my magic wand and I could look at how we might invest our dollars and our time in an environment like Afghanistan, and again, it hasn't been tried, so I'm not saying that this is necessarily a lesson identified, but I would love to see what happens when you put your money into education and when you put your money into public administration and capacity building and what might have happened. In Afghanistan, there was such dismal literacy rates and such a low human capital that many of the challenges that we've had since our time there has been because of this low literacy, inability to absorb the funding that has been provided. So those are some of the, just off the top of my head, when I think about lessons learned, is a clarity of mission. If it's a nation-building mission, say it is, commit to it, fund it, and to invest in people, invest in their education and their literacy, and to more balance the budgets.
Renee?
Okay. All right, thank you. So you promised that you were going to provoke us, and I don't think you succeeded because I think that we both agreed with pretty much everything you said. But just to sort of take up your challenge of trying to propose what are some of the major lessons, I was tempted to turn to my students. There are several people out here who've taken the PCR course. Would you like to answer the question?
I'm going to have to.
It's a simple one. Sorry, no, I won't. I won't. The simple way to answer the question is to say, well, you just have to avoid making 3 mistakes. Don't do too much, don't do too little, and don't do the wrong thing. Now, if you manage that, then you're all set. The only problem is those things are not easy to do. I think one of the things that we have learned that is helpful in broader situations is humility. It's important to keep in mind that when you go into any place that the U.S. is going in or the U.S. and its partners are going in, you need to recognize that going in and saying we are going to build a state or we are going to build a nation or we're going to present democracy is a lot of hubris. And we need to avoid that and think a lot harder about what's possible and what isn't. Along the same lines, you have to have a better understanding of context. I think one of the problems that certainly came up with regard to Iraq, and I think it would apply equally in Afghanistan, was this assumption that you were dealing with a blank slate and that the way we do things will work, and because they work here, so let's make them work elsewhere. You have to understand the place that you're going. You have to try and understand the way people there think about their lives and their goals in order to come up with some way to develop a system in cooperation with the people on the ground that has some possibility of survival. And another one, which I think Deborah alluded to as well, is you have to have patience. State building, nation building, which we could talk about for several days, what either of those concepts mean. These things don't happen fast. Change doesn't happen fast. And trying to maybe move forward in an incremental way is a much more realistic approach to take. But Americans aren't very good at being patient. I mean, this is our longest war at this point in Afghanistan, and we're ready to leave even though it's not really clear whether we've accomplished what we set out to accomplish, even if we knew what that was.
Well, I think you make some very good points. In Afghanistan, one of the things that we had, which we didn't have in Iraq, was something called the Afghan National Compact, which essentially was to transform Afghanistan into a somewhat better form of Wisconsin. I suspect we won't meet any of those goals, and indeed, when you have people describe the real world goal, it is Afghan good enough, which means that something survives after we leave. And that is not a facetious remark. That is basically where we are at this point in time. I think it's interesting to me that neither of you mentioned the control of money. But it was one of the key problems in both countries that, frankly, we had no ability to control money. Essentially, particularly on the aid and the civil side, because we simply couldn't figure out what was happening once it went to a contractor. We did try under an exercise General McMaster's led, which came 7 years into the Afghan war, to actually for the first time institute an accounting system. But right now, we are going, as part of this April issue, this is supposed to elect people who can go from something on the order of 23% of administering an aid budget to administering 50% after virtually all of the aid and the military people leave. And we have no way to tie those expenditures in the field to our own observation because we're going. We've already shut most of the forward areas. We also have no measures of effectiveness. And it does strike me that one of the test of governance, unless I'm wrong, Deborah, is not whether they can spend it on anything useful, but whether they can spend it.
Well, actually, I mean, that's such an important point because part of my experience in Afghanistan, but also in Bosnia and Kosovo and other places, is that oftentimes there is this pressure, this impetus to spend money and to build buildings and roads as if that reconstitutes a nation. And so there's such a pressure on us to get that road paved, get that school built, and we like to point to all the schools that were built, the health clinics that were built in Afghanistan, a lot of the other infrastructure. But I'm not sure that that makes a new nation. And you're wisely right about can we account for those dollars? And that's one of the lessons that I would also identify is that when we do this again, we need to have something like a special investigative or special investigator general. We need to have the audit controls in place. We need to have some fiscal accountability. And I like the idea of an integrated budget, something that UK does, but instead of having different budget lines. But again, how the money is spent and what we think that we're getting with the money is particularly important.
Just to add a little bit around the margins here, I agree with you about control of the money, and it's worth noting that the Special Inspector General, who was established with regard to Afghanistan. I think that position was created in 2006 or 2007.
A little later,
And for Iraq, it was
a little earlier.
a little earlier. But well after the U.S. had gone in
Absolutely.
and started spending money, that there became this recognition that we need some way to try and figure out what's going on with the money. Another thing that's worth noting is, this gets back to the bigger question of how we spend our money. So much of what the U.S. has done in recent conflicts has been done through contractors. And part of the problem with that has been that while there are excellent people out there who are working as contractors for the U.S. government, with the amount of money that has gone into this picture, the agencies of the government have reduced their contracting staff. So the people that know how to administer contracts has gone down at the time that the budgets that they're overseeing have gone up. So I think all we're doing is adding to the problems that you're pointing out so far, Tony, rather than solving any of them. That's one thing that I think is very important, building on Deborah's point, this idea of needing to have accounting and oversight early on. Another is thinking about the absorptive capacity of the places that we're going. One of the things that you point out in something you wrote a year or two ago about the amount of money that's been spent in Afghanistan and Iraq pointed out that 30% of all the money that the U.S. has spent in Afghanistan was allocated in 2012 and 2013, which is an enormous sum of money. And again, it leads to this problem of huge sums being sent into a country that doesn't have the capacity to run them on their own, so you end up with much more corruption. You end up with parallel administration going on to oversee the problem, and then this is all going to go away as the U.S. pulls out. So you're creating unrealistic expectations of what governments should do, and then you're going to pull the plug. So it works badly at both ends.
And certainly the timing, again, as you point out in some of your writing, that a big part of the money that follows the civilian and military surge in Afghanistan after 2009 and 10, that money didn't really arrive with agencies until about 2011 or 12. So at the same time that we have a drawdown of military forces and a transition of the U.S. mission, we have this large amount of money, and it makes you look at when's the window of opportunity and what might have been done and accomplished with that money earlier, 2004 or 5 or 6. Again, have we been more clear on our objectives and a commitment to those objectives?
Let me ask you.
Can I make one last point about that? It's also worth noting, not to be too much of a wonk here, but as academics, there is academic literature that has looked at the question of when states are more able after conflict to do well with the money that they might get from outside, work by people like Paul Collier, which suggests that 3 or 4 years after a conflict ends, and we can use the word ends in quotes since that's, as you pointed out, a very difficult point, there are times when more aid would be more helpful than either too early or too late, which academics know. It would be nice if that sort of fed in to policy making in a more regularized fashion, perhaps.
Well, I think you raise a very interesting point, because one of the presidential candidates in Afghanistan has written with an American author a book which makes the point that basically we threw so much money into the country without any control and planning that we corrupted it and created a almost totally disruptive structure in the economy, which is all oriented in the market economy towards a vast amount of military and aid spending. And that we would have been far better off spending much less, not inflating the structure and supporting the traditional economy. But the question I'd also ask is, we often point at the country we're trying to help. Now, I remember that we took almost all of the economic planning function in USAID and the State Department that went beyond project aid out when the World Bank was formed, when Jesse Helms conducted his reform of the civil side. I think those of you who have been in the military realize that we always reinvent the military operation that deals with civil military affairs at random. There is some large spinning wheel that handles the basic promotion structure and allocation of people. But if we don't have an integrated structure to deal with this in the State Department, in the NSC, and in the Department of Defense, who are we to advise others?
I'll only say that you're speaking to the choir here. I was quite disappointed in returning to the U.S. and finding out that we still don't have the institutional capacity, possibly at the NSC, where we integrate our tools of foreign policy and integrate our budget, where you actually have State Department, AID, Department of Defense, and other agencies that are part of our foreign policy work, actually some sort of a coordinated, integrated planning apparatus. It is true that Department of State, through the Coordinator's Office of Stabilization and Reconstruction, and now Conflict and Stabilization Operations, has moved toward an integration of working with other agencies, and also recognizing that future operations, stabilization and reconstruction, may very well be part of future work that they're doing. USAID has also institutionally, there's been some changes there, for instance, Office of Military Affairs. And you've seen some of these institutional adaptations, but I'm waiting for the day that we do have some sort of a more integrated civil military institution, hopefully at an NSC level, that as we go forward with future missions, that's where that decision-making and that integrating and planning could occur.
I agree.
I think what neither of you mentioned is who are the planners. And I think that, particularly given the fact we are talking to people associated with the Maxwell School, is a challenge. Because even when you look at the World Bank really was not fully operational in Afghanistan until 2011. It was never given the resources to independently collect data on the economy. The problem is we have amazingly precise figures coming out of Afghanistan, which unfortunately have no substantive backup whatsoever. I mean, the data on education do not take account of non-teachers, ghost schools, combat zones, and a lot of them are simply based on the extrapolation of a census, which is a computer-generated estimate of population for which there's no input data. We have somewhat similar problems in estimating medical effects. And we can't even credibly estimate the amount of the narcotics in Afghanistan, because for political reasons we do most of the estimation in farm gate prices rather than the actual prices of narcotics that affect the economy. If that's where we are, where do we get and how do we build the internal competence? It isn't just a matter of managing the money, it's being able to plan, set priorities, and establish meaningful measures of effectiveness. And you can correct me, but when Secretary Clinton tried to do this and created the equivalent of a special QDDR, if I have my acronyms right, we're still waiting for the first measure of effectiveness. I was hoping you'd say no. That's supposed to be provoking. You know, to paraphrase someone from my past, $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there eventually adds up to real money.
Well, that was certainly a problem in Afghanistan. You know, we're looking at possibly a budget of dollars spent maybe around $650 billion. And so what's $1 million here, $1 million there? It goes back to the accounting issues. It goes back to planning issues. It was interesting. I mean, besides being sort of a pseudo-planner, only because I have military in my family, so I like to think that I got a little bit of planning of my capabilities from them, as well as from my Maxwell School education. there. But it is true that State Department, we're not necessarily planners, and AID is not great planners. And one of the things I saw in Afghanistan was DOD ended up becoming one of the largest development agencies, or donors, if you will. If you think of development writ large as infrastructure, providing public administration training, ministers, they had advisors to many of the ministers, and oftentimes what DOD, our military force, would sell themselves on, that they are planners. So a lot of the planning that's been provided for Afghan ministries, for the U.S. Embassy, and for other missions came from our military colleagues who were there as planners. I don't know if that's a strength or a weakness to AID, State Department, or other agencies, but we certainly relied on that planning. But it does make me concerned about what does it mean to a new government or reconstituted government in Afghanistan when much of what they see as expertise is coming from military.
Let me quote Lawrence of Arabia, who is quoted with the same quote every time we discuss these issues, which really boils down to do it their way. Now, as we look back, was the problem that we tried basically to create so many new institutions and structures and basically ignored their values and systems? Would we have been much better off to focus on what they can do with the systems they have rather than trying to radically change them?
Are you talking about anywhere in particular, or just the broad exercise of the last?
Well, I was thinking of just how much we succeeded in changing, let's see, Egypt, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan.
You can talk about those. Okay.
Well, Indonesia, what country would you like me to name?
Well, I think, Renee, you had also talked about sort of our going into Afghanistan with a certain hubris, and absolutely true. I mean, I'm not sure that one of the, again, lessons identified that I've been kicking around my own head is I'm not sure that we knew who the enemy was, and we certainly didn't fully appreciate that context of Afghanistan. We hadn't had State Department there since the assassination of our U.S. ambassador in the early 80s. USAID mission had closed in the late 80s. And so our information and knowledge and experience with Afghanistan was dismal. And our understanding of their way was dismal. And what dominated a lot of the discussions after 9/11 that I remember being a part of was sort of this mythology, the stereotypes. You know, Afghanistan's never been conquered. You know, the brave Afghan, the Afghan that can be bought, the Afghan that's not loyal. What do they know about democracy? What do they know about representation? And a lot of these kind of myths as we went into Afghanistan. And so I'm not sure that not only did we not know our enemy, we certainly didn't know Afghanistan very well. And we also presumed that our way was better, or at least it had merits. Now, I think that's true. I have had the privilege of having been there for the last 4 elections, and I have learned that Afghans fully appreciate what an election is. And just anyone that's been tracking the election the last few days, the lines of men and women that are behind buildings trying to get their last-minute voter registration cards and participate in this elections. I have seen people who come together in a village and sit down and in a way that's comfortable and common to them, where they will deliberate community burdens and problems, and they will come up with some sort of consensus way of going forward. And so the idea that there were inclinations toward democracy there, there's, civic engagement is something that they understand. And I don't think that we fully appreciated that going into Afghanistan. And I think there's been much more thinking about that in the last 4 or 5 years about how do we look at what they know, what is their way, And where is the blended way of going forward, building on what some of the good ideas that we can bring to that mission, but also building on their own strengths, which are there.
You raise a very good point, and I'm going to ask both Renee and you to address it, which is, it's wonderful to have elections, but what happens a week later? Because in Iraq, we ended up with paralysis for approximately 11 months, a power struggle which helped generate what essentially is a low-level civil war between Sunni and Shiite, with the Kurds on the margins. In 2009, not without a certain amount of pressure, we managed to avoid the second round, but this time it isn't a practiced president, and in a country of power brokers, we are not really talking about an elected political system as much as what happens if the new leader is elected in one round, who will actually end up governing. And then when we say governing what? With what money? In what area? And I think the estimate is about 4 months at a minimum for this new structure to take hold. Well, let's see, it's April. We will more or less be out of the country, except for whatever we intend to leave behind. And in a 3 areas, 2 consulates effectively and an embassy, by September of this year. One does have to worry a little about exactly what having a good election. Let me rephrase it. Which would you rather have? A truly bad election and a good leader in government, or a truly great election and a bad leader in government?
Is there a third choice?
There may be, but let's wait till it happens.
You want to take that on first?
No, but I can say a couple of things. I mean, one of the things that I think, I'm going to back up a little bit first. This issue of what you can do, I think one of the things that's worth thinking about, because it gets us to where we are thinking about the election, and maybe we're still on the lessons part, because I think part of where we are is trying to understand how we ended up where we are today in somewhere like Afghanistan before the election. It would help if you could do some advanced planning. Now, you pointed out this need to understand what you're working with. One of the expressions that's been used that might be worth thinking about is principled incrementalism. Again, building on what is already there and how people already understand the way their communities work as a way to start expanding potential, if you want, governance processes, democratic processes, whatever an end goal would be, again, with a very long time frame. Now, one of the questions is, what are elections meant to be? Are we talking about elections as a stand-in for democracy? Are we talking about elections as indication that our efforts to build democracy have succeeded? Or are they an opportunity for us to declare victory and go home? We've done all of those, I think. Now, in this case, I think the good news is that, well, let me say maybe the good news, because your choices were pretty terrible, but I'm not sure which one we're going to get. I think it is a positive thing that there will be a change of leadership after this election, because the idea that you're going to move from the person who has been through 2 terms of government to, we hope, a peaceful transition to another leader, if this all works well, and if all of the people who are running for office accept the results of the election, which is not a given without lots of protest, that is an important indication that this idea of voting and choice has taken hold in a way that may give us hope. It doesn't address the question that you raised about whether any of them are in a position to really be able to lead and govern. But I would like to think that that's one thing we would like to see come out of the election process. I'm not sure we'll get there. I don't know what you'd like to add to that.
Well, before my international affairs work, I was Deputy Commissioner of Elections in Syracuse. And I come from Chicago politics and New York City politics, and by the way, Eastern Kentucky politics, which is some rough politics. And so I think that I have a certain patience with the evolution of governance as well as with what to expect from the elections. And so I tend to look at it as a glass, I guess, half full. I am encouraged by the fact that more women than ever are very active in this campaign. There have been campaign workers. There are 3 women that are on the candidate slates that are vice presidential candidates. There's over 300 women running for the provincial councils. Let's remember that it's not just the presidential election this coming Saturday, but each of the provinces' legislatures, our state legislatures or assemblies, are also being elected. And so I find hope in the fact that you see these photographs, and I talk with friends in Afghanistan, that for the first time ever, women are coming out to rallies. Women are participating in ways that they haven't in the past. Women are candidates. Women are campaign workers. I also like what happens in an election, that it opens up this political space, and that what you may not always see with other times and other administrative and governance functions, but during an election, you have human rights groups and civil society organizations and men and women and young people. Oh, by the way, don't forget that 65% of Afghans are under the age of 25. What does that mean for that country? And so the fact that they are participating in unheard numbers in campaigns and supporting candidates, all of that gives me hope about what this election will mean. I'm also very hopeful that this will be the first peaceful, constitutional transfer of presidential power in this country ever. And that's important as well. So while I'm not sure who may win, and I certainly have questions about the state of Afghanistan after the elections, and it's not going to be decided on Saturday. There will be a prolonged period. There's a legal period of challenges and complaints that have to be adjudicated. Most of us expect that there's not going to be a clear winner, that there may be a runoff election or some kind of compromise that happens between candidates. I still find hope in these elections for Afghanistan.
I am under firm instructions in a few minutes to allow the audience to challenge you as deeply as they can. Notice I mentioned you, not me. But let me just go on to a different set of challenges. Right now, we have watched a massive set of upheavals in the Arab world. Some of these are playing out at a lower level in Southeast Asia. But in most of those challenges, we have some kind of military activity or presence. It's not post-conflict, but it is also obviously an area where there are massive civil challenges. How do we approach problems like Syria, like Egypt? How do we deal with an issue like Tunisia or Libya?
When are you going to start answering the easy questions?
Yeah, really.
Well, I was told that the Maxwell people could answer any question.
Okay.
Well, we may have some expertise out there that can answer those questions, certainly better than I can.
No, you don't get to deflect. You have to.
I go back to some of the lessons that we started the conversation off with. I don't know if I have the answer to any of these problems, but I certainly, in reading some of your writing and in reading what others have been in the last decade, from what we've learned from Iraq and from Afghanistan, what we learned from Bosnia and Haiti and Kosovo and East Timor and Mozambique and Sierra Leone, there is a literature that we can look to for some answers now. Now, I can't summarize that literature for you because I'm just starting to get into it myself.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll take that one. I'm not sure I can address the question exactly. I mean, one of the things that I think you can think about, what is it that you see that is repeated from place to place? One of the things that you see is frustration with existing systems of governance and frustration with there not being what is happening in Afghanistan this week. The ability to have an election to choose leaders. So that, I think, is an important idea. Now, one of the things that we know from the democratization literature, I'm putting on the geek hat again, democracies, they're fragile things to some degree, but one of the important things that happens is experience with a democratic process, even if it fails, is one of the things that matters the next time around, that makes states more likely to be interested again in trying for a democratic system of government, perhaps with more success. So I think that's one perhaps hopeful note. I think the other thing that you might be seeing, certainly in the last couple of years, and I'm hoping that there are other people in the audience who might want to jump in on this when we get past the current interrogation. One of the things that you do see is a question about what people think democracy means. Yeah. And we certainly see this, thinking about sort of my first book, back to sort of communism in Eastern Europe. One of the problems in places like even Russia is that the aspiration of what democracy means leads people to expect very quickly that their lives will get better. And particularly in the Middle East, I think one of the things that we're seeing is that, not surprisingly, it takes a long time to go from a very poor economic situation to something that works better, hopefully with better governance, which is not necessarily clearly there yet. And people get frustrated. And they feel that democracy has not served their needs, particularly if there is a sense that it's leading to just more of the same behind-the-scenes deal-making. So I think this gets back to where we were to begin with. You need to have a lot of humility, and maybe we need to not sell what we're trying to do. And I'm not going to say that I'm not even sure who we is. Selling the notion of democracy globally should be done with caution, because you need to think about what it is you're trying to promote or encourage, and back to how it fits with where people are and how long it might take them to get the benefits that could come from a more democratic and open political system.
I'm a little struck by what you say, because a friend of mine was conducting a survey in Yemen, and the question essentially was, what did you prefer, a strong leader, democracy, or Sharia? And when young men were given the opportunity, they decided they preferred all three. Mm-hmm. It isn't always clear that you have support for democracy where people are distinguishing what it means. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn things over to you for questions. I'm going to ask a favor. First, a question mark normally ends with a question. It has one element. It is not a compound sentence, because I will never be able to repeat anything that is a complex question. And I would appreciate it if you could just briefly identify yourself. But let me give you the opportunity. And I saw this gentleman first, and then there, please. Stand up. Please stand up, identify yourself. We have a mic coming, and hi.
My name is Lou Rappaport, and my question is, everything you folks have discussed is, we read about and we hope. Whether democracy will ever work in a lot of these places, I don't know if anybody knows the answer, unless there's a strong guy from North Korea or other places that decides how democracy will work. However, nobody alluded to the fact, and I've read a lot about Afghanistan being the Wild West and parts of that country, that when we leave, eventually, the Taliban is going to come back in power. How do you all feel? How strong are they? What will happen, in your opinion, down the road when we're out of the country, we don't bring advisors back like we're doing in some of these places? Will the Taliban come back to power like they're blowing up people now, or are they really fading?
I think we get the question. I really, because we have limited time, I'm going to ask people to make it short. I don't know if either of you wants to address it. If not,
I'll jump in. First of all, I want to caution all of us, with the drawdown of our military and the departure of military, and of course it hasn't been decided how many will remain in Afghanistan, but we're not leaving Afghanistan. It still would be one of the largest U.S. embassies and one of the largest aid missions in the world there. So we're going to be there for a long time. And they're looking at a 10-year plan, the transformational decade for Afghanistan. So there'll still be advisors, diplomats, development specialists in Afghanistan. To your question about does the Taliban come back into power, I'll let others answer that. But certainly we know in insurgencies that at some point there's going to have to be some kind of political settlement. And what that looks like, who negotiates that, is for the future to see. The next president, certainly in Afghanistan, will be a part of that. Most of the public opinion polling in Afghanistan, and there has been public opinion polling since 2005, shows that only about 10% of people actually support the Taliban. So not to walk away with imagining that everyone in Afghanistan supports the return of a Taliban. And there are different kinds of Taliban, too. So I will leave that. I'm sure that you have some opinions on return of the Taliban.
The practical problem is that we have no decisions yet as to whether we will have an advisory mission on the military side large enough to hold things together. General Mattis and General Allen recommended a force of between 13,000 and 14,000 troops, which included some Italians and Germans in the north. That decision simply hasn't been taken yet. The reason for those numbers was to have enough people to provide some kinds of emergency support and have enough advisors to operate with the Air Force and each of the corps. But we don't have that decision yet. The strategy General Dunford has, and here you have to remember the Taliban has its limits, but it assumed that the Taliban would take control of parts of the east and the south. We basically will not have any forward aid presence. We will basically be operating out of embassies using the Afghans or proxies. The only way to know what happens is to find out first what decision we actually take, find out whether the Afghan government can put it together, find out whether our allies are there. And all of that has to happen between now, essentially, and September if you're going to implement it by the end of the year. And I can't give you a prediction. And I would again repeat the fact that we have no real budget for the Department of Defense component. All we have is a placeholder number. Let's see, in back, please.
Hello, I'm Mahdi Sanglahi. I graduated from Maxwell, and I took class, the PCR class, so I was here. I think the problem in Afghanistan is it's not going to be a success, and it was not a success, and it has not been a success, because the problem has not been identified.
I'm going to have to ask you to focus on a question.
Oh, yeah. So I have to tell at least 2 sentences before my question. And that is the insurgency. The Taliban have been active and have been fighting. And the countries in the region, specifically Pakistan, is keeping the conflict going and sees it in its interest, destabilize Afghanistan. For example, madrasas in Pakistan have been shut down so the elections get disrupted. What do you guys think? How could we move forward with Afghanistan if the root of the problem, which is in Pakistan, which is supporting the Taliban, is not addressed?
I was waiting to see how long it would take before someone would raise Pakistan.
I think, first, we do not assume that there will be a solution to what's happening in Pakistan. The Pakistanis are, again, evaluating just how dangerous the position to them from these extremists is in Fatah. There's a very good book written by a woman recently who's a reporter from the New York Times, however, which raises all of these issues. The basic strategy that's involved here is that they will have a significant presence in the east, and some of the areas that we had spent a lot of time holding will be lost. The same is true in parts of the south, where essentially for all the problems that happened in the south, we are already watching the Taliban reassert themselves in drug areas. But they are a relatively weak force, and you do have a relatively large Afghan force. And while they can create acts of terrorism, and they can often intimidate, it's not clear that they can actually take a large part of this structure. Because in addition to all of these fighters, you have warlords and power brokers, and they often do lose. They also are divided increasingly into different groups and factions. Now, how will this play out? The fact is, we just don't know, and we don't know whether Afghanistan, if it fails in Kabulistan, will fall to the Taliban or simply go back to what Afghanistan has been in the past, which is a relatively weak capital and a whole group of regional power brokers and ethnic factions. Now, let's see.
Can I
Yes,
just add to
please.
that very quickly? I think one of the things, and this builds on what you said earlier about what is likely to see happen with sort of expectations about a smaller area of control by the current Afghan army with support from the West. The ideal situation would be that the Afghan government get its act together and be a functional state that provides an alternative model of governance to the areas that the Taliban is in control of, that might lead to more support more broadly over time. There were a lot of mights and ifs in there. But it is sort of taking the long-term strategy of if the core of, or the rump Afghan state manages to survive and thrive seems like a strong word, but survive and do okay, then more people that might be in other parts of the country might be more interested in living in that state than a Taliban-ruled state. Building on Deborah's comment about sort of the degree of support for the Taliban. The other point that's worth making is it would have been a good idea to look at a larger regional approach early on. And that, I think, was a mistake.
The gentleman sitting back there. Oh, please wait for the microphone.
I'm Clarence Maloney. I've been a consultant in Afghanistan for a good part of the last 6 years. I want to raise a different issue. You said the 65% of the people are under age 25. Population will double within 30 years at the present rate. The growth rate of population is 2.4%, doubled in 30 years. Now, Afghanistan is a water-stressed country. Large part of the country, most of the country gets 4 to 6 inches of rain a year. Will they double their food production within 30 years? If not, what is the relationship of this issue with these kinds of things you have been talking about? Is this a larger issue, and how will it be approached? It is not only the increasing population, it's climate change. We know now about climate change.
Please,
yes, okay, I leave it with you. How will you change your political and aid approach?
Well, that was no small question. It is true, certainly. I've been interested in paying more attention to the role of water and water rights and land rights and climate change and other issues as causes of conflict. And you're right, I don't have the answers about what it will mean for Afghanistan, but these certainly aren't issues that are going away for Afghanistan or for the region.
I think that one thing that is an important issue here, though, that question has a parallel. Long before any of the upheavals in the Arab world, the Arab development reports, which are written by 37 Arab economists and one Westerner, basically raised all of these issues for the Arab countries. They also raised the fact that it wasn't so much a shortage of water, it was the chronic misuse of water. The broader problem was that even if you could solve the food problem, you couldn't basically find a job creation problem. And one of the difficulties was that for many forms of agricultural reform, you need to add capital and remove people, which is happening with hyper-urbanization even in Afghanistan, as I think you know. So all of these variables are a problem. And whether climate change or the rest, it isn't just in Afghanistan or any other country. You see it in Iraq and elsewhere. And it is a challenge for all of us. I think we do need to acknowledge that, and we don't have answers. The lady in...
Stephanie Kenny. I teach sustainability and public policy at Maxwell, and 30 years as a diplomat at state. You made a very strong case for the consequences of a militarized, domestic dominated foreign policy process and institutional infrastructure. Perhaps before we go back or in someplace else, we need to get our own house in order. What would you consider to be the priority actions or initiatives that need to be taken in the next year or so to begin looking at rebuilding or renovating the department, AID, and the military-civilian diplomatic balances?
I think this will be one for you.
The questions just keep getting easier.
I'm going to just, I'll take a quick stab at that. One, you really need to create a strong economic analysis and planning staff, and it needs to focus on developing countries. It is ridiculous to go out to Afghanistan and Iraq on occasion and see macroeconomic data generated which are perfectly suitable for a Western economic structure but have no relation to the problems in the country. You can't avoid demographics. You can't have a situation as we did in the planning in Afghanistan where nobody bothers to see the number of people entering the labor force and talks about job creation as if there is no population growth. You can't have the idea that education is literacy when it doesn't create jobs or skills, and when it often doesn't create literacy. You can't afford to have the State Department and aid not assess effectiveness. You can't afford to not administer money and programs. You can't afford to trust contractors. I'm going to be very blunt about it because I've been blunt to them. The amount of corruption, waste, and fraud has been endemic in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And part of it is we didn't have a structure, as I think both of you pointed out. And let me just note, the entire State Department is about the size of a really large junior college. So where in the State Department do you learn how to administer these very large programs? And with aid gutted by Helms and others, without ever really, and I think you would recognize this, deciding how aid interfaces with state in full, because no one is formally charged now with aid planning, you have a structure which fundamentally needs to integrate aid into state, and that hasn't been done. Now, a lot of these were raised in the QDDR, and unfortunately, as I think many cabinet members learn, the bureaucracy often survives leadership. But at that point, would either of you care to join in?
Deborah?
Maybe that's a good project for CSIS and Maxwell.
Oh, I like that idea.
Let's see. The gentleman over there, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Greg Flato, recent graduate from the Maxwell IR program. Renée de Nevers, how are you? And my question is, can you put in place a successful, vibrant democracy if you don't already have what I would say are the proper values or the proper liberal values in place? And the example that I'd like to reference is one country that I consider to have a successful transition to democracy so far. Tunisia has a history of strong liberal values such as strong women's rights, high education levels throughout the country, and I think that's one of the reasons why you have a successful transition so far. Thank you.
When are the easy questions coming?
You know, let me just say that often democracy is essentially the extension of civil war by other means. It isn't a matter of having liberal values. It isn't a matter of not being corrupt. Tunisia is an interesting example right now. The question is basically, are you using these means to deal with ethnic sectarian tensions, with regional issues, tribalism, problems that affect states? The alternative, in the authoritarian sense, buys time but doesn't buy solutions. It just buys time for everything to get worse. And I think one of the things that we honestly, to deal with your question, is don't tie political solutions and governance to our values, our culture, and the level of sophistication we have in our economy. The problem is, to what extent can you work out viable solutions that are alternatives to civil conflict? And that is something we're probably going to have to learn the hard way, because all you have to do is take a really firm look at the map. Is Nigeria and India better for some form of democracy? Yes. Is it anything like our liberal values? No.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think we have to remember that. Now let's see. I'm not sure when they're going to pull the chain, but I think Jim will let me know. All right, please, and back.
Good evening. I'm Gwyneth Woolwine, and I work at the Government Accountability Office. And so I very much appreciate your remarks about the importance of the accountability community. And I wanted to go back to one of the things that was discussed earlier regarding a national security budget. I did see that in the QDDR, and I've heard about it since I first came to Maxwell, the idea of that. And I wondered if you could talk about what are the real political obstacles, because it seems to me that they are political, to getting such a budget in place. Thank you.
It is a really excellent question, and watching it in the field and in Washington, as I think, since you work for the Accountability Office, you already know, it is that while everyone will talk about it, nobody will give up their stovepipe.
Exactly.
There was a I'm not going to name her, but brilliant woman I worked with in Afghanistan who described the U.S. effort there as a series of golden silos. And I think that often was what happened. We never could integrate the civil side, much less the civil military side. And there wasn't even any continuity between major command regions. I think if you want this done, you do not need the authority of Congress. but you need a level of presidential concern and leadership that goes beyond the day and would support a fundamental restructuring. And let me say that is not immediately apparent.
Renee, a last word?
I was going to ask Deborah if she had a last word that she wanted to make on that point.
I don't, not on that particular point.
Okay, then I'll take it back. And I'm going to go back a question just because since I get the last word. I think it's really important to reiterate this point that democracy takes many forms.
Absolutely.
And the key point being that people don't have to have a set of values to make a democracy function. And it doesn't matter if what shows up in Afghanistan looks like a democracy that we would recognize if it's something that is moving people to a system that they feel they have a voice in. Because, and your Civil War comment is perfect. The idea of democracy is that you contest political power without shooting each other. And that's a big step in the right direction. So I'll stop there.
Well, that's a challenging place to stop, and it's also, I think you all will share my view that we've had a really remarkable and far-ranging discussion, not only of the specific problems of Iraq and Afghanistan, but the broader challenges that we face in trying to build stable societies and self-governing societies. There are many takeaways from this, but the one that's most important to me is I was just delighted to hear how important issues like budgeting, planning, and administration are to successful efforts in this respect, which is why we're all in this business that we're in at Maxwell. And so I don't think it was exactly planned this way, but I think it really is a reflection both on the importance of the work that we do, but also the challenges. And I think we ought to take up the suggestion about thinking about how some of the specific issues we talked about here, we can do a better job, and how in partnership with CSIS we can begin to think about this, not only on the lessons learned and what the literature shows, but I think, frankly, from our perspective, even more important, how we translate that into action, because that is the big challenge, right? It's not just understanding where we went wrong or what might we do better, but how do we get it done? And so much of this discussion talked about that transmission problem. How we go from policy to implementation, how do we make things work on the ground, which we are so poor at. And if anything, this is something that Maxwell ought to be good at thinking about, because we're all about translating ideas into action, both in our work at the school and particularly in what our graduates are doing, and so many of you being involved in these things. So thank you for this really terrific discussion, especially Tony, thank you for all your experience and sharing it with us tonight. So we have a final part of the program. And I'm now going to introduce Christy Anderson, who is the Chappell Family Professor of Citizenship and Democracy at the Maxwell School. She's a well-renowned scholar and expert on women in politics, political parties, and American political history. She's written on how political parties and other civic organizations work to incorporate immigrants into American political life. She's also written about the gender gap, civic participation, prospects for electing more women to Congress, and the changing meanings of U.S. elections. But from my perspective, even more important than all that excellent scholarship, she's been a leader in the Max courses at Maxwell, something that I think Maxwell deserves to be very proud of, and something that I hope we can build on in the future. But even more important is Christy is the embodiment of civic engagement. I happen to live in a small town east of Syracuse called Cazenovia, where Christy serves on our town council and is a member of our Cazenovia Area Community Development Association, and shows that we put into practice what we preach in the Maxwell School about civic engagement, and I've been inspired by her and delighted to be part of her constituency. So let me ask Christy to come up.
Thanks, Jim. I haven't thought of you as a constituent before, but I guess I should think that way. Deborah, can you join me up here? This is a little bit of a surprise, perhaps, but...
Do I need this?
No, you should take off your microphone, I think, is what Norma told me, because we don't want two microphones. So other people know this, but you don't, that one of the reasons we're here is to honor you. And all the work you've done that really exemplifies the reason the Maxwell School was founded. So as you've heard in some of the introductions and as you've inferred from hearing Deborah talk, she has done a lot of interesting work around the world. She's investigated war crimes in Kosovo, worked on political reconciliation in Yugoslavia, observed elections in more than 22 countries. She's a recipient of the U.S. Department of State's Superior Honor Award, the Medal for Exceptional Public Service from the Secretary of Defense. In Afghanistan, which you heard about where she's been most recently, she traveled around the country with a huge team of civilians in over 80 locations in Afghanistan. She was embedded with U.S. forces. She took on a lot of critical roles, including serving as U.S. Deputy Head of Mission during the Marine surge in the strategically key province of Helmand. She was principal advisor for Afghanistan's elections, as we've talked about. She was critical in helping set up the elections that took place after the Constitution of 2003 was constructed. She served as the first USAID field program officer in Afghanistan, embedded with Special Operations Forces. Her years in Afghanistan make her one of the longest serving civilians working for the US government in Afghanistan. And we've heard about what she's now doing, which is advising the US Army's Joint Regional Training Centers. She consults for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in upcoming elections. I think you're going to Ukraine in May, which should be interesting. She advises a number of organizations and is a recognized expert on post-conflict, I guess I have to say now, elections and governance, the development of civil society, women's advancement, and civil-military relations. Now, way before all of this, as Jim mentioned, Deborah earned her Master's of Social Science degree from Maxwell in 1982, and in focusing on cross-cultural and political psychology. And then she worked in a variety of positions in local and state government and politics, including election commissioner in Syracuse. She then returned to Maxwell in the 1990s to get her PhD in social science, an interdisciplinary PhD program in Maxwell. And this is when I got to know her. And my computer archives don't go back that far, but I assume that you took a course from me or something, and that's how we got together. But Deborah and I share a deep interest in the movement of women into leadership positions, particularly in the political arena. And her dissertation, perhaps surprising you to all of you, because you've heard her talking about global issues in Afghanistan, her dissertation, which I advised, focused precisely on women moving into leadership positions. And she looked at men's and women's campaigns, political campaigns in central New York, in fact, looking at how their candidacies were presented and how voters responded to them. And you have probably forgotten about this, but based on her dissertation research, she and I collaborated on an article published in a leading political science journal looking specifically at how voters processed information and made decisions in male versus female races. And in fact, I now see that that piece remains one of my most frequently cited articles. So, among her many talents are that she's an excellent researcher and writer. I want to stress this. Deborah is someone who, with the PhD she received in 1995, could have looked for an academic job and been very successful. She could have gone into consulting and been even more successful, at least financially. Instead, she chose to channel her, you could still do it too, and maybe you are. Instead, she chose to channel her intellectual interests, her compassion, and her commitment to improving the world in other ways, and hence the very illustrious career that we have heard about. Now, let me just talk for a second about the award we're presenting tonight. The Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs gives its Spirit of Public Service Award to individuals and organizations whose goals and accomplishments reflect the core values of Maxwell. Recipients have been found both within and outside the immediate community of Maxwell alumni and scholars. These recipients exemplify in their deeds the Maxwell School's mission of understanding, celebrating, and encouraging the sort of far-reaching contributions to public life that we hold as our highest goal. Awardees are motivated by a drive to improve the lives of other human beings and, more broadly, by a deep commitment to the public good. through things such as advocacy, political enfranchisement, social entrepreneurship, good public management. They have affected transformations globally and nationally, as well as in smaller communities. Now, I dare say that most recipients of this award do not risk their lives on a daily basis as they are living out their commitments. But Deborah has done exactly this. And she has a sense of hope in the face of danger and tragedy, which I think is contagious. And I think you saw that in some of her remarks tonight. She's an optimist who retains her belief in the capability of individuals working together to bring about positive change. This is exactly what the Spirit of Public Service Award wants to recognize and honor. If anyone represents the spirit of the Maxwell School, I think it's you. And we're very proud to add your name to this list of Maxwell citizens who have received the Spirit of Public Service Award.
Have you got it here? Yes, okay.
I am truly.
It's very important. Okay, I will take the cover off. It's a very iconic award, as you all said.
Gosh, it's a beautiful award.
Take this off. Okay. Here, you have to hold it though. Come on, oh my goodness.
We get the Maxwell.
There we go. All right. Perfect. Great. Congratulations. Do I
I am truly surprised and honored, speechless, and I know many of my friends and colleagues that are in the room will find that surprising, that I actually can't find words. I was so grateful just to have this opportunity to come here this evening. I was grateful to Syracuse and to Maxwell School and to Dean Steinberg and to CSIS for even hosting this and just giving an opportunity to have this discussion. And I was looking forward to seeing a lot of former colleagues and friends and Syracuse alumni. And I was looking forward to your questions, how you would prod me to think about this experience. I never imagined that there would be an award at the end of the night. That's like icing on the cake. There's probably not a day goes by whether I have been in Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Macedonia, Washington, D.C., wherever I might be, that I have not thought about my work in Syracuse and my education at Maxwell. It has carried me day in and day out, both the practice that I was involved in Syracuse, as well as the academic education, the training that I received at Maxwell. I remember really wrestling with coming back from my doctoral work because I was doing government work that I loved and I didn't want to leave the government work that I was doing, but I also wanted to come back and complete what I thought was my academic education. And I also couldn't decide whether I'd be in political science or maybe anthropology, sociology. I love them all, public administration. And Maxwell provided a place for me where I didn't have to make a choice and I could do what I loved. I could continue to be a practitioner and also be able to ask the large questions about civic engagement and citizenship and democracy and women's participation. And so, and I think often of those days. Just a couple of months ago, I was, actually, now I think about it, last fall, when I was in Afghanistan for a very short time on an assessment trip. And I was in a small village called Cordesman, Afghanistan. And in the crowd in front of me, as I'm walking through a marketplace, I look and there's a 13 or 14-year-old, and he has a Syracuse University Maxwell sweatshirt on. And I go running through this crowd. Here it is, this American woman running after, calling after him. And through his English and my very bad Pashto, he tells me that this is a sweatshirt from his uncle who went to Maxwell School. And so again, it was a reminder of, even in Afghanistan, in a far southeast place, Maxwell was with me. I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to have this, and thank you for all of you being here to watch this.
Well, I can't think of a better commercial for Maxwell than if we planned one. I have to warn you, you'll be up on the Maxwell website in about 8 minutes if I can make that happen. Really, it is, I can't think of anything that really does better exemplify what we're all about than the work that you've done and the words that you've spoken to us today. I hope for the students and the young alumni here, that's an inspiration to you, and I hope that we are successful in doing as well by future generations as the people who helped you get to where you did in the past, and I'm very conscious of that great legacy. I'm very proud to be a piece of it myself. It remains for me to do the most exciting part of the evening, which is to invite you all to join us in the reception outside and to continue the conversation and continue to meet with old and new friends. So thank you all for being here tonight. It was terrific, and thanks to the panelists.